human beings trying to figure out who they themselves were, and what they're saying about Christ, may in some way be true about all of us. And the only reason they couldn't portray it that way is because it's a very threatening idea.
Well, it would have been, especially to the context of the civil religions of the time,
Right.
both Hellenic as well as Judaic.
Yeah.
It ignores the corporate responsibility that would have been imposed.
And just, Joe, just to comment one thing, this is why in AJC parishes all over the world, you will very rarely see the Man of Sorrows. You'll very, very rarely see the body crucified. You'll see crosses, but they're not the cross of the crucified. The cross, you'll occasionally see the very symbolic crosses, obviously, is probably the most common, or you'll see the cross of the risen Christ.
And as I understand Christian iconography, that was true throughout the Middle Ages. In the medieval churches, the crucifixion was not really very sanguinary. And it was kind of only with the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century that Catholic art began to take this really morbid turn. I mean, if you looked at this art, some of it, these, not to offend anybody here, but these hearts with like crowns of thorns around them, blood gushing.
You can see every drop of blood and sweat.
Yeah. I mean, that was the way when I saw Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, I'm sure some of you did.
Totally right.
It's like, I guess I left the movie thinking, yeah, I guess if you flogged somebody that much, they would bleed that much. I guess I never really thought of it, but
Least spiritual Christian film ever made.
It's a snuff film.
Yeah, you also.
But anyway, I mean, where the sense of this, the whole process, the point is, and you sometimes hear this, in Christian churches at Easter time, but the whole point is really the lessons, in a sense, kind of the resurrection. But it's a thing that gradually got submerged. You become identified with the sufferings of Christ, and it gets rather sadomasochistic. I mean, I've never really been terribly tempted by the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, which, you basically go through and visualize and, to the extent possible, feel. I mean, I'm sure it would be a profound spiritual experience. I'm not really sure it's kind of the best way to go about it. But, some Jesuits might tell me I'm wrong. Anyway, it's always interesting to see what. I mean, art is a reflection of what's going on in the collective psyche, and what is going on in our psyche today? Well. There's a lot of commercialism. So you have art that's about commercialism. I think one of the strangest pieces of art I've ever seen is by an artist named Jeff Koons, who's pretty well known. And it was in the San Francisco, I think, Museum. It was really ghastly. It was a more than life-size image in white with gold of Michael Jackson and his pet monkey. It was like, I'm sure it was as ghastly as it was intended to be. It's interesting to see this in sacred art. As of course the Orthodox tradition was always very, very, very careful about its realism. The fact that there's no perspective, or the perspective is extremely odd and unnatural in Orthodox icons, is not because they didn't know how to do it, but because they really wanted to have it not seem too realistic. So the icon is sort of like a window into heaven, as they sometimes are depicted, rather than just kind of an image that. I mean, the Orthodox kind of objected to the Catholic iconography because they felt, maybe not without reason, that it could lead to base passions. If you include among base passions sadomasochism, which there's a strong element of that in it's not just in Dan Brown novels. Any other thoughts? Yep.
What would you view as the state of esoteric Christianity today?
Trying to keep me here all week, are you?
Well, the answer to that is simple, which is I don't feel I'm well informed enough to say. I do have to say that there seems to be a lot more interest in these more interior forms of Christianity than there were. I don't, for example, the bookstore upstairs here, there are things on, things like, centering prayer and spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, which are, esoteric exercises of, sort of a kind. And I don't think you would have seen that a long time ago. So I think it's sort of percolated into mainstream Christianity, at least kind of Catholic and liberal mainstream Protestant Christianity. Evangelical Christianity is another story. I don't know, but sometimes you wonder what's going on there. I know there was a Baptist church. I found this out only kind of accidentally. There was a Baptist church in Memphis that was using inner Christianity for the reading group. It would have been interesting to hear what they came up with. And to be fair, I think it was an American rather than a Southern Baptist thing, but nonetheless. I think there's a lot of interest in it, and I think, there's kind of a desire to resuscitate it. I don't think there's a lot of the kind of deeper psychological understanding. A lot of this is psychological, right? It's psychological, not Freudian, but in a way it is. And you could say that, for example, the esotericism of the Philokalia, is really about this kind of spiritual psychology. I think there's a lot of interest in it, but it's not very structured or well informed. It may be the difference, and you can argue about this as well, maybe a difference between mysticism and esotericism. Esotericism is doing something like what I try to do here. Well or badly, accurately or inaccurately. It's some kind of way of structuring inner experience. Mysticism seems to be very uninterested in this. I'm using these terms somewhat loosely, but mysticism it's really not interested in anything in between, but kind of getting to God, and everything else is kind of irrelevant or just a distraction or that kind of thing, which is all well and good, but it's useful to see some of the landscape along the way. I think the Christian tradition, particularly in the West, since pick a date, has definitely been much more toward the mystical, insofar as it's been interested in it at all. The thing about mysticism is, as I've described it, doctrinally it's fairly safe. Since you're not really making any comments about anything, you're just kind of trying to go right to the source. It doesn't threaten anyone's doctrine or dogma. And so you can do it comparatively safely in, rather fraught contexts. If you take it to certain extremes, like the Quietists in the 17th century, where, they, kind of got to almost a virtually kind of almost couch potato attitude toward it all. Maybe that's unfair, but they sort of brought up short. It's interesting because, to use the terms I just described, one example of esoteric Christianity is Saint Teresa, because she is giving like framework for structuring her experience, just the way I've talked about. I personally find her writings hard to read, not because of the content so much as that there's this almost oppressive humility about it, and her constant insistence on, I am your woman, of course, don't know anything about all this, and it kind of gets grating after a while. You realize, of course, she had to do that. That was necessary in the context of her time. It's just in our time, it just doesn't need all that, well, at least not to me. But she was, there are people who attempted to say that St. Teresa's spiritual teacher, and I don't know the details any more than I'm about to tell you, was a Jewish convert who introduced her to some Kabbalistic concepts. I don't know if that's true. She has like this kind of 7 levels of spiritual experience, and there are a lot of 7s in esoteric spirituality around the world for reasons that have never been terribly clearly explained. The whole 7 thing is very, very mysterious. Why is it such a sacred number in so many different contexts? I mean, I'm familiar with many of the explanations. None of them quite seems to do the whole thing. And it's, maybe it is a mystery. Anyone else?
Rebecca, you had a question?
No, it's okay.
Go ahead.
It was more about the quality of the experience of the experiencer. And because for someone like me who's fairly new to this path and the way my brain is wired, it's quite terrifying that having glimpses of that state. So it's not always that feeling of coherence and connectivity that you describe.
Well, I mean, there's a whole literature about that, and the literature about that can be filed under the term dark night of the soul. What you're describing is, I hope a fairly brief experience, but experience in kind of a larger context is this. I showed you guys a novel by William Dean Howells for some reason this morning, and I looked at his biography. At some point in his life, he experienced what the biographer called a Swedenborgian vastation. And Swedenborg was into vastations, at least at certain point. But it's a similar thing. It's a dark night of the soul. I mean, here's the analogy that comes to my mind. You're learning how to swim. When you're learning how to swim, it goes without saying you don't know how to swim all that well. And there's a point at which you kind of leave the safety of shore. You haven't actually reached the dock yet, and you're swimming. And it's a little bit frightening, and it's a little bit disorienting. I would say that'd be some kind of analogy to what you went through. The analogy, the image of the boat crossing the water is very, very, very wide. But it's something like that. You kind of let go of familiar moorings, at least for a second, because these are the familiar moorings. So, what am I if not all these things? And it's a profound question. People experience it in different ways. Let's take a more mundane example. A highly career-obsessed man loses his job. He was identified with this identity as executive assistant, vice president, general manager of Corporation X. That was who he was. And he only, until he became, next stage up on the ladder, that's taken out from under them. So who am I? And then there's this kind of thing is sometimes associated with a midlife crisis or whatever. But sometimes there's at the end of a job or a marriage or something like that. People's identities or core identities are called into question. you could say that this kind of exercise is a practice in doing that, if for no other reason than when something like that does happen in real life, which it usually does to most of us at some point or another, you're not so completely thrown by it because you realize, you may even consciously remember it or not, but some level or another, you had this little glimpse, and since you know that some deep down inside, you're not really all these things you identified with. Well, to use the analogy from the Gospels, you're building your house on rock rather than on sand. Right. This is all shifting sand. Your body comes and goes, its sensations come and go. We know the thoughts and minds come and go, emotions come and go. Even deep emotions. Someone you love today, you may hate 6 months from now. That happens fairly often in life. All of that is building a house on sand. And this, in a way, it seems very, very precarious because there's nothing, it's like there's nothing you can trust. Here's to put it in a somewhat Zen-like way, you can trust in nothing, but you can trust in nothing. Not if that's a sign you say.
Well, I was just going to mark the analogy, and it could have been that I think I might have used it in conversation correspondence. Talking about when you mentioned the boat, is that there's a point where you leave shore, and of course you can see the shore behind you, getting smaller and smaller and smaller. But there's a point where you get far enough out where you cannot see the land on the other side, neither can you see the land where you're from, and that's where things get really disorienting.
Exactly.
And so, you orientate yourself kind of before you set off and keep going. Or, you die in the middle of the game.
Oh, that really helped.
It's okay, there's game over. Restart.
Well, maybe one more. I think I have to 4, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can go as long as people have questions.
Or maybe 1 or 2.
I actually have a personal question.
Mhm.
Where in Waterbury did you grow up? I was born and raised there, that's why I'm asking.
I mostly lived on Lexington Avenue near Fulton Park.
Okay.
Where did you grow up?
Bradley Avenue, Conclave.
Where?
Bradley Avenue,
Where is that? I can
off of Highland.
sure.
Southwest.
Yes, I think I may have even known someone.
Small world.
Yeah.
It was very, very funny. We were back there like a month or so ago, and I sort of, so I took my wife and kids past the house I grew up in. And, one thing that was charming about it was that the gutter had fallen off at one end in the front of the house, so it fall down like this enormous diagonal slash mark in front of the house. The way it looked. And then I said, to my 4-year-old son, this is where I grew up. And he said, yeah. How early they learn. But it's an odd city. It had its heritage. Anyway, yeah.
Over the whole span of esoteric Christianity over its entire history, in your view, personally, what's the most unfortunately neglected author or book or piece?
Well, I'm going to give you the first answer that comes to my head. I don't know particularly why. But one book I liked, which is very, very hard to get, is Some Characteristics of the Interior Church by I.V. Lapuhin. He was an 18th century Russian esotericist. My friend Chris Banford, who's also written on Esoteric Christianity, some of you may have heard his name or read some of his things, has a copy of everything, it seems, and he hasn't had a copy of that and lent it to me, but it's explaining some of the themes that I'm talking about now. And the interior church is not an organization. Waite, A.E. Waite, who translated that book to English. He was the member of the Golden Dawn, designer of the tarot and so on. I think, as I remember in his introduction, he said, well, people in this interior church recognize one another just as Englishmen recognizes Englishmen across the globe. And, it's, I think you'll agree with me, it's not a matter of grips and handshakes and that sort of thing. It's some sort of, a person, maybe if you're not completely asleep and you come across someone else who's not completely asleep, you may recognize each other. My friend Warren Kenton, who's a Kabbalist in England, he writes under the name Zed Ben Shimon Halevi. I think he said he was in the London Tube and he saw this Buddhist monk, and he said, I could tell he was awake. And this is because I happened to be awake for that particular time. I could tell that. You could say that the interior church, in its real sense, is the body of people who are like that. Of course, and they have, outside they have no external sign, but there's some kind of internal recognition that takes place.
Reminds me of Kurt Vonnegut's Harass, the group that you belong to, that when you meet somebody, you belong to the group, but it doesn't have a name.
Yeah.
I was thinking it sounded like pornography. You can't give a definition, but you know it when you see it.
I don't know. I mean, I in a sense, I'll throw the question back at you, and anyone is free to comment on this. When you come across people from other, say, arguably esoteric Christian background traditions, do you feel a commonality with them?
Yes, but
Yeah, but beyond Christian, I guess.
Yeah, I wouldn't
It's
limit
the-
it to Christian.
I really resonate with the sense of a brief moment of wakefulness, noticing another brief moment of wakefulness, and kind of catching that wink.
Yeah, well, it is non-sectarian.
I actually find beyond that experience of grips and handshakes and shared things, though there is the common bit now these days, because Masonic stuff is available on the net, so just talk to another Mason and you can tell if they've actually sat in the lodge, as opposed to the password stuff. But I've actually found that the true kind of determinant of somebody else who has that thing that has embarked on that path is whether or not they can quote Monty Python. Because pretty much every esoteric Christian or Gnostic I know for some reason can do that.
Because we're all old.
Yeah.
Fight your tongue.
I may fail in quoting Monty Python, but I will offer you a funny little insight for what it's worth. I've always been very interested in Gurdjieff's teaching, G.I. Gurdjieff, and for some rather peculiar reason, in The Meaning of Life, one character spouts like kind of a 1 or 2 minute summary of Gurdjieff's essential teaching, of course, of this kind of skit in a corporate boardroom. Now that's not accidental because John Cleese actually was part of the Gurdjieff work for a while, so it's not just an accident or a fortuitous thing. But I thought it was, it's just, and of course then they pass it over and the next one. You were saying something about hats or something. The next thing. Yeah, the Monty Python. Anyway.
Well, maybe another question related to that idea of the interior church that you're talking about, and this is something I've had reflected back to me occasionally by people. So, is it kind of crazy to try and set up an actual organisation based around the idea of being an esoteric church? Certainly we're not the first organisation to try. It does seem to be a vexing endeavour, if you look at the history of it. It's a path fraught with difficulties, obviously.
You're not supposed to admit that on camera.
So we can fix it in post.
You can fix that in post.
There's so much we've got to fix in post from this particular recording, if you cast your mind back over.
Split up the knots in those sentences.
Well, I'll quote Monty Python.
I don't think Mel Gibson's going to watch the video.
That's probably true.
in the life of Brian, he falls in with this, this Jewish Liberation Front, and it's called the Liberation Front of Judea, something like that. And they start squabbling, and finally one of them says, "We're forgetting all this. We should unite against the common enemy." Yes, the Judean Liberation Front. This other splinter group. The communists did that in the 30s. The Trotskyists and the Stalinists, fought more than they did with the fascists or argued.
Well, there's a thing. I mean, if you look, one thing that we're fans of is the Roman Catholic Johannite scholar Raymond Brown, and that's exactly what he goes into in his hypothesis on the early community, the beloved disciple, that the gospel is also, at the same time, of course, a telling of the story we all know, but it's also the, between the lines, it's the history of a particular community, and it's split, and that the epistles are a response from one Johannite faction to the other, who views the other as being the real enemy, as opposed to they first started off being against the world, and then they're against each other and so forth.
When you say the epistles, you mean the epistles of John?
Yeah.
It's, well, the question that it raises for me, well, I'm answering is I'm going to get some water. There's this weird issue of factionalism. Why is the Theosophists are a classic case of this? What is the theosophical, chief theosophical principle? Well, the brotherhood of man or humanity, whatever you like. But that had any number of schisms over. When it came right down to it, it's really personality. It wasn't like well, maybe it was. Christianity 375 AD, maybe that was about personalities too, more than we like to admit. But there are these conflicting traits in human nature. One is to band together, and the other is to exclude. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to have one without the other. What kind of commonality do you really have? Us against them is the most common form of commonality, uniting against the common enemy, as it were. This obviously had a lot of use, in Neolithic times. In kind of a contemporary religious context, it's less useful. I would. So my answer to what you're saying is that the danger of factionalism of whatever sort is always a good thing to watch for. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it is a question of personalities. One of the best books written on this subject, one of very few good books written on the whole subject of esoteric groups, is by my aforementioned friend Warren Kenton. Ben Shimon Halevi wrote a book called School of the Soul. Its early editions are called School of Kabbalah, and I think the book is basically identical if you come across it on the internet. I don't think it makes much difference which one you get. And he discusses a lot of these dynamics